Hello and a warm welcome, everybody, to Africa Talks, to edition number 23. We have had a short winter or summer break, depending where you are. I'm more than honored that you are all in the call now, and I would like to introduce my co-host from Namibia, Sipiwe Luti-Betsi. Good to have you in the show.
Thank you, Marco. I am Sipiwe, and I'm looking forward to co-hosting Africa Talks and discussing African and European topics with the alumni of International Journalist Network, IJP, and our distinguished guests.
Africa Talks is designed as a digital platform for the exchange of knowledge and ideas between journalists and experts from civil society from both continents. I'm Marco Vollmer. I'm a member of the board of International Journalist Programs, IJP.
Our topic for today is a new strategy for cooperation with the African continent. In January, Federal Minister Schulze presented the Federal Republic of Germany's new Africa strategy. The African continent is being courted not only for its raw materials, but also for geopolitical interests. Presidents, heads of government, and ministers from around the world are discovering Africa and looking for partnerships, including for majorities in votes at the United Nations.
We want to talk about this strategy with Secretary of State Dr. Bärbel Kofler, Dr. Elizabeth Nanziri from South Africa, and Joe Asunka from Ghana. We speak with the Secretary of State. She is, and I may introduce her to you now. She is since December 2021 Parliamentary State Secretary to the Federal Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development. From March 16 till December 21, she was Federal Government Commissioner for Human Rights Policy and Humanitarian Aid. She's a member of the Bundestag since 2004. And joined the SPD, the Social Democratic Party in Germany, in 1991. She is a bank clerk, graduated in computer science and a doctorate in linguistics. And Secretary of State Kofler, welcome to Africa Talks.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be on that talk.
We would also like to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Nanziri. She is the director of the African Center for Development Finance and a senior lecturer at the Stellenbosch Business School. She is a British Academy scholar and a former Newton International Fellow at the University of Oxford Center for the Study of African Economies. She has taught both undergraduate and postgraduate students at renowned and previously marginalized academic institutions. Her research field is in development economics, focusing on finance, behavioral economics, gender, and welfare. Elizabeth has substantial experience with the policymaking process in emerging and developing economies. She spent time at the World Bank Office of the Chief Economist for Africa region in Washington, D.C., and has consulted for the African Development Bank, United Nations, the GIZ, IDRC, as well as national government departments. She holds a PhD in economics from the University of Cape Town. Dr. Elizabeth, good to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me, and good morning, good evening to your listeners, and I look forward to this conversation.
Last but not least, we have Joe Asunka on Africa Talks. Joseph is CEO of Afrobarometer. This is a Pan-African research network. He was previously a program officer at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, where he managed a portfolio of grants that support efforts to increase transparency and accountability in fiscal governance and foster citizen participation to improve the delivery of public services in Africa. Oh, it's a long description, but I hope you get it. Before joining Hewlett, Joseph was a lecturer in political science at the University of California, Los Angeles, where he taught courses on African political economy of development, research methods, and data analysis. Prior to that, he was a program officer at the Ghana Center for Democratic Development, where his responsibility included serving as a data manager for Afrobarometer network. Joseph's research interests include distributive politics, elections, electoral processes, and migration. Joseph holds first and second degrees in statistics and computer science and economics from the University of Ghana and a PhD in political science from the University of California at Los Angeles. Joseph, welcome to Africa Talks.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, for having me. This is really great to be with you this morning. I look forward to this conversation.
Great.
Great. Let's jump into Africa Talks. We'll start with you, Dr. Kofler. There have already been a few Africa strategies from the German government. Could you please share with us what's new about this strategy that was presented in January? And what are some of the top priorities of German development cooperation with Africa?
Well, yes, thank you very much for that question for the beginning. That's true. We had once in a while a new Africa strategy, but what I really believe is what is new was the process, the whole process, how we developed that strategy, because it was not something we invented in Berlin, just sitting in our offices and discussing amongst ourselves. It was really a strategy where we had to reach out to many people on the African continent, to the African Union, to scientists, to civil society, to politicians in various countries, and also to young people, which I found very inspiring to hear their point of view, how they want to see the future of their continent in the end of the day. And also, of course, to European colleagues, to civil society here. So it was the first important thing was this tremendous outreach we had. And that was something I had a discussion around with more than 35 embassies, African embassies here in Berlin. And that was a little bit also one of the results that is a spirit which is felt in that strategy. That is an outcome of a discussion and an ongoing discussion, which is then required by all the participants and by the African embassies and so on and so on. So that's the first thing. And that has to do that we want a strategy with a new approach. Well, it's always principles you discuss about. The approach is respect and reciprocity, because we believe there are so many topics. We learn vice versa from each other. There are so many questions which are not answered in our society, in European societies, but there are interesting discussions on the African continent going on. I read in preparation of this talk today that, for example, the African Union had a conference on positive masculinity. Quite an interesting topic if we talk about how the gender balance should look like. I haven't seen about a conference like that by the European Union. So that's what we mean with reciprocity, to really learn from approaches across our two continents. We have global discussions if it's coming to climate change, if it's coming to how we address future pandemic, maybe events which might occur, how we solve issues of global trade and how a fair share for everyone should be developed on those issues. There are so many global issues we have to discuss together. We are fighting, actually, maybe all of our, or most of our countries in our continents are fighting a kind of crisis in democracy. We want to defend democracy. And I know that Afrobarometer always do statistics about how people on the African continent think about democracy, for example. And I think that we have so many common ideas on those values where we have to develop together common solutions to the problems we are facing globally. So that's one point of our strategy, which is very important. It's true, also the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, was pointing out that Africa is the new center of gravity. That's showing that there has to be more interest than we've shown before to our neighbor continent. There's so much going on our neighboring continent. That's also part of the strategy. And well, in a nutshell, it's more social, more ecological, and more feminist. So those 3 points are quite important for us to underline that. And we want to tackle the big issues by global alliances, by bilateral alliances, by also alliances with European partners and the African Union partners. So we do a lot with Team Europe initiatives, and that's laid out also in the concept. And it's about, if we talk about topics, it's about the big social ecological problems we need in all our societies, transformations of energy systems, for example. We have to do it in a way that societies can sustain or people can find jobs. So it's about a just transformation into new systems of production of energy, for example. It's about creating, in that circumstances, also decent jobs. At the end of the day, it's about decent jobs and added value. We have a big chapter in the strategy on job and economic issues. We know the figure about the 25 million jobs which has to be created every year on the African continent for the young population at the end of the day. So we want to be part of that, want to support African Union, African Free Trade Zone on those issues. That's a big important topic. It's about orientation on the goals which African Union and a lot of African member states were themselves deciding in their 2063 agenda, for example, but also in other national action plans. So it's about orientation on that. It's, as I was pointing out, on gender equality. And at the end of the day, it's about being clear where we are standing, of course, not denying that we are having interests, everybody has interests, and being clear with our values, formulating that, but being in a fair conversation with partners and seeing their responsibilities for their own societies and working together on the questions I was pointing out. So that's in a nutshell. It's a big strategy with a long, long documentation. So I try to be as brief as possible.
Thank you very much. I think we had received a good overview now, and allow me one more question. As you have pointed it out, the new strategy puts particular emphasis on partnerships and alliances. Which partners do you have in mind, and for which purposes do you want to use them?
Well, of course, we have in mind, on the one side, on the European side, we have in mind European partner countries. It's about Team Europe initiatives to a variety of topics, from the support of health system to the issue of job creation at the end of the day. There are many, many partnerships. It's about infrastructure, so Global Gateway European Initiative is playing a role, of course. But it's about alliances across the Mediterranean. It's about alliances with the African Union on their agenda. We are one of those countries who are supporting, for example, African Union and implementing Africa Free Trade Zone, which I think is quite important. Not only me is thinking, the World Bank is coming up with quite impressive figures. What could that mean for growth on the African continent? So we're supporting that. Also in Team Europe initiatives, which is underlining that it's all a little bit interlinked. And of course, we are discussing also bilateral topics with all our partner countries, and there are more than 35. I'm looking to my left side if I get a little bit of assistance. I think we have 35 partner countries on the African continent. And we are discussing on various topics with them. That might be in a variety of energy partnerships too, where it's required, nutrition, safety of nutrition. So it's in a big range and in a big broad. And of course, it's also private sector partners and civil society. So it's the whole. In German, we say Blumenstrauß, the whole bunch of flowers, or the whole broad range.
I think it's a good picture, and I would play the ball to our African panelists. Elizabeth, what is how do you assess the new strategy?
First and foremost, without really having had a lot of time to go through it, but I am glad that I have listened to the secretary and the summary. So it would appear that there's been a lot of stakeholder engagement in coming up with what we have, the document that we have. And I think what we would like to see, which probably needs to be tightened, is to perhaps have a fact sheet of some sorts where we have what the department or ministry has been doing over the years, and superimpose that on what is new. That would make it easier for the agents and the stakeholders to literally see what is new here? Because I think that would be a question that everybody would ask, how different this is as you started. But when I think about it, it's comprehensive given the extent of stakeholder engagement. But in looking at the various let's say, contributions to the various economic agents, to the youth, for instance, to the private sector, what is different? That needs to come out very quickly. And I'm suspecting that, or I'm proposing that a fact sheet would help us there. Otherwise, it looks well intended. It captures pretty much everything that we think about in the SDGs. Yeah, if I should say that. It's a pro-SDGs, which is very beautiful and relevant and welcome. We just want to be explicit, concise on what the new additions are. And I think I'll discuss other issues later in terms of, okay, how can we look at agriculture, for instance? How can we look at the youth, for instance? And how can we look at the private sector, for instance? I think we will look at that going forward. But for now, I believe it's quite comprehensive. It rhymes with the Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. We just want to pull out those spices, that will appeal to all the stakeholders that were approached in coming up with this strategy. That's what I would have to say now. Yeah. Thank you
for that glimpse of an reaction. Joseph, what is your opinion on that?
Yeah, thanks so much, and I thank you, Secretary Kofler, for the overview. I couldn't agree more with Elizabeth's take, but I would also add that I particularly like the tone of the strategy itself, because the emphasis on partnerships and working through partners is very critical, because often, in previous times, it used to be the case of a development partner doing something on the continent and not really working as a partner with actors on the continent. I think that brings a lot of value in it, and I think it lends it a lot of credibility. At least it signals Germany's commitment to think through what is done and how it is done, and not just necessarily what they come to do. How you do it is also just as important as what you actually do. The second piece is just the values of respect and reciprocity. I think that is also super critical, because it's in any endeavor, having some values, guiding values that guide what you do is very important, because it then leads you to ask yourself, what we used to do and what we are doing and what is different. And that's why I like Elizabeth's point. Now, what is it that is different? The tone is different. The values that are espoused is clearly different. It would be good to just extract those. And then say, for some of the existing programs that are already there, that Germany is running or the European Union is running, how do we ensure that these values become part and parcel of that? So whether it is respect, reciprocity, partnerships, and the gender lens or the feminist lens of it, how does that then permeate some of the other programs that are already existing and going forward? And I think that's my takeaway from this. It's really concrete on the values, and I appreciate that much.
Thank you for that. Dr. Kofler, in the strategy, one of the overarching topics is a just transition. What does that mean for Africa?
Well, thank you for that question on a very precise topic. Just a quick reaction on what I learned from Elizabeth and Joseph, because I think that's very important what you were pointing out, and it's giving the idea that we really have to come up with something comprehensive. What we did before, how should we change? I think that is very much appreciated, those ideas, and it's something I also want to underline. We understand that strategy as a process for our working together, and it's not something fixed where you cannot move left or right or wherever. It should be something which is living and working, and we are working with that. And what is different, and therefore I'm coming back to your just energy transition question, it's about a strategic approach. It's not about small projects. I'm always saying nothing against projects. There can be wonderful projects, so it's always have to be a little bit not only thinking in boxes, But what we really want is to develop together with our partner countries strategic approaches to solve problems. And one thing is quite clear, we don't have a perfect answer on what is a just energy transition partnership. We are in the middle of one in Germany at the moment. We are facing the issue stepping out of coal, having a time frame, having a discussion, how much does that cost? What does that mean for our job creation? What does that mean for our industry? How to produce the energy? And we are facing a lot of challenges, to be frank on that. And we have, especially now with the war against the Ukraine, a total different mindset. What could we do or should we do, and how to react on that? So it's a learning process. And what was agreed in Glasgow in 21 at the COP was to come up with ideas how industrial production is possible, how a transformation from coal or fossil energy to fossil-free energy is possible around the globe, not only in so-called industrialized countries, but in emerging economics in different countries. So we are working not alone. That's another thing with an alliance. That's with multilateral donors. That's with different partners. I've been last year at the African Development Bank. We were discussing that with South Africa in that case. And we're trying to work and come up with ideas what has to be changed on the energy sector, what could be measures on a social basis to come up with new ideas for decent jobs, for example. So it's a broad concept where we don't have the answer. We are willing to support with the experience we've got in our society. We are willing to support also on a financial ground, but there has to be a discussion on how, for example, energy laws has to be changed in certain parts to make it work. I don't talk about the specific South African problem now. But of course, that's also part of the issue, how an energy system should work in a certain context, what has to be done in certain regions. We have that experience, what we do in North Rhine-Westphalia or in Eastern Germany, where we have to close down our coal mining. So at the end of the day, it's about exchanging those experiences and coming up with precise ideas how to support financially this transformation. It's a process. It's not that you see, I really don't have fixed answers, but we are on a process, and not only with South Africa. It's a Indonesia discussion. We're discussing with Senegal, so it's an international discussion with alliances, not only with Germany.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. Dr. Nanziri, your reactions here, the whole just transition and what it means for Africa.
Thank you so much. I'd rather kind of react to what the Secretary is saying, in actually linking it back to where we started from. This is respect. I'll just pull out that respect and the collaboration and, this stakeholder relations and outreach. I think the one thing that I would like us to think about is the contexts. Yeah, we would like to see these reforms, but we also like to understand and appreciate the contexts and find a way of approaching and putting our information forth in a manner that will be acceptable and received by the populations that we want to assist. What am I saying here? For instance, in South Africa, we all know that, yes, there is an issue with energy, but you have to be very careful how you're going to market the solution to this problem. Yeah, and you will hear a lot about nationalization or privatization, the NNP words. So you need to be a bit sensitive and appreciative of the social, let's say, contexts in which you're operating. This might not be probably the same as maybe Senegal. Yeah, it might be easier in some contexts than others. So I like the fact that we started with respect. Yeah, so let's try to respect the communities in coming up with solutions. I'll rather, stop there because I'm seated at the core of the conversation of just transition and energy. Yeah, just making sure that we sell it properly. We sell the reforms and the solutions in a receivable manner. Yeah, for the people that we're trying to help. So we don't want to end up with a situation of, for instance, taking us back to the structure adjustment programs. Yes, you implement and the people don't understand what you're implementing, and sooner or later there's resistance or you're blamed for what seems to have been a good idea. So I'm just calling on the co-minister and the departments to, in the process, try to find what language to use, how to position it, and respecting the communities while coming up with solutions. I'll stop there.
Thank you for that, Dr. Joseph. Would also like to hear your thoughts on the topic.
Right, thanks for that. I think, with energy transitions, and of course the use of the word just is very important. It underscores the approach that is supposed to be used, and this, whether it is justice with respect to the people involved and justice with respect to climate itself, climate change itself. And I do think there's, if you can have economic transformation, if you can have development on the African continent without having to burn extra fossil fuel, I think that could be a value that everybody will support. Generally, the data that we have on climate change across the continent, about 40 countries that we have so far, generally people are very supportive of any climate mitigation action, including just energy transition. And so I think there will be a lot of support on the continent from the citizen side if we can transform or work to transform our economies without necessarily damaging the climate, because that is what people are also fearful of. Because the effects of climate change is becoming more and more rampant. I mean, floods and cyclones, even in places where they used not to be the case. As we speak now, there's a cyclone that is hitting Malawi, and some of my colleagues are stranded somewhere. They can't really get out of their homes. And so it's very real in people's experiences. How can we mitigate that? I do think that just energy transition is one approach, but the thing is, what is the cost of doing that and who bears that cost? And I think being very clear about the supportive role, especially giving this new strategy, I see there's a lot of emphasis in the supportive role that the BMZ and other actors want to play in making sure that they support Africa to transition in a way that doesn't go down the path that developed countries have gone through, using fossil fuels as the basis for development. But then the lessons from Africa can be valuable in that sense, because how do we transform an economy without burning extra fossil fuel? Can we do that? And if the world can do that, I think it will be a valued lesson for the rest of mankind in terms of development.
Thank you, Joseph. Another question for Dr. Kofler. You have I think, just said a bit to that, but I want to point on that more precisely. Your ministry and the German Foreign Ministry have developed a strategy for a so-called feminist foreign development policy. And what does that imply for the cooperation with Africa? Could you explain it in some more words for our audience?
Some few words, because that's always a little bit provocative, of course, but it's especially we decided to use that terminology because it's about breaking up the structures. And it's about, of course, patriarchy. It's about structures of patriarchy, but it's not only patriarchy. It's about, at the end of the day, of all structures which are hindering that people can participate equally in, for example, political decision-making. So at the end of the day, it's also about racism. It's about dealing with colonialism. Yes, that's the thing we have to look also on our own past and how we're dealing with that. And it's about, it's about justice on the one hand, because it's not fair to exclude half of the world from a lot of possibilities and decision makings. But at the end of the day, it's not clever. Because if you don't lose the potential or the creativity of 50% of the world's population, I don't think it's a good idea. We have evidence that, for example, economic growth, fighting hunger and so on could be really, really on a positive track if we include women in decision-making, in the issues of resources. And at the end of the day, it's of course about those 3 R's, rights, resources, representation. But it's, as I was saying, it's about the structures behind it. It's not about having a new project where you tick a box. It's about changing structures. And honestly, when I've just back from Malawi and Zambia, I had a lot of interesting talks about that topic. And there are so many colleagues on the African continent and civil society where I see it's actually what people really want to discuss also with us. So I got that impression. I'm quite interested what you is telling me, but I got that impression that there's a lot of positive reaction on that topic. Of course, you have to frame it also in all our societies with how you deal with that topic in various cultural contexts. But at the end of the day, it's about changing structures. And I think that's also about having a look in our societies. That's another topic where we cannot come as Europeans and saying, oh, you know, we know how to do that. I don't live in Germany in a society where rights are equally already fulfilled. We had just in March now equal pay day, because then the fair pay is starting in the mid of March. So we don't have equal payment and so on and so on. So there's so many things we have to change in our societies on that topic. And some negative reactions you get in European or in German societies are because it's understood that we have to change our own structures also. It's about, at the end of the day, breaking down patriarchal structures. And that's what we have to do in Germany and in other parts of the world.
Elizabeth, I wonder how you value this new development here in terms of German foreign or development policy, and I wonder also, like, whether there is is there always the same reaction to it? Do the partners in Africa, do they understand the point the government now is doing here in Germany
on the feminist policy?
Exactly.
Okay, so remember, there was at one time, much earlier, when we were talking about gender and gender equality and that card. In some instances, we start hearing that, you know, the gender card is obsolete. However, I think we need to realize that when we're talking about equal representation, for instance, in politics of both men and women, well, we should also add the youth, yeah, because it's the reality that we have an aging policy or legislature and leaders. We have old leaders, and that's not the youth are not happy with that. I think we need to probably think back at pathways. How could we perhaps get to that empowerment, political empowerment and political voice of women and our youth? I'd like to emphasize the youth because we have a youth dividend in Africa. How do we get to that? What are some of the pathways? And I'd like to emphasize rather economic empowerment. Yeah, if we empower the youth, we empower the women, that agency will also drive them to political positions, because it's until you have something in your pockets that you can have a voice. Nobody wants to listen to a poor person. A poor person is also easy to compromise. So for us to get these ladies and the youngsters on the policy desk, I think we need to first and foremost get something into their pockets. And this takes me back to what I said earlier. The gender conversation seems to be obsolete and maybe relaxing. People are like, oh, no, we don't want to hear that anymore. There's a new way to doing it. There's a new pathway. And this is where I would like to see what we are doing for the youth, and in line with the 25 million jobs that the strategy is talking about. If we can do that, then we can get our youths, we can divert them from, for instance, opportunistic political engagement. because opportunistic political engagement is not sustainable. They're going there because the pockets are empty, because they don't have any economic empowerment. And this will be the same for the women. Now, if we can start with creating these 25 million jobs for both, the youth who are men and women, both genders, male and females, then we can talk about, we don't even have to worry about the political representation, because what we are seeing now are women on this in these positions, but they cannot engage. They are there, you count the numbers, and I'm glad we have the Afrobarometer here. You might see, yes, that they are there in numbers, but are their voices being heard, or are they just simply serving coffee during the meetings? And that is the reality. I'd rather we start with empowering them. How can we empower them? Maybe I can just think about that for a moment. We might want to go, we're still relying on agriculture, so we can go through that channel. The GMZ and Germany departments have been very instrumental in technology useful for agriculture. I think I want to implore them to go a step further, to invest in maybe value chain, agricultural value chains, which will create the jobs. Yes, once they create those jobs, then we are going to have empowered women, empowered youth who have agency that will be a pathway for them to go onto other platforms like the political representation and decision-making that we are talking about. Yeah, I can definitely talk more about how we can empower, how you can invest in the youth skills, which is usually the problem that we're talking about. For those that cannot go into agriculture, how about you think about self-employment development? Yeah, this is the entrepreneurial thing that we're talking about. How can we do that? I think I saw a model in India where you have self-employment development institution. Well, here you're talking about, for instance, partnering, yes, with financial institutions, which I think is one of the partnerships that you have, that I saw in the strategy. You can work with them. They provide guarantees. They're providing skills here, but a portion of that funding goes towards providing startup capital to these youth, men and women, that can help them start their businesses. That is the empowerment that we're talking about. So you could invest in either the agricultural value chain, which will include, which will increase the employment opportunities for our marginalized that you want to see moving forward into these spheres of political engagement. This will also help Africa, on the other hand. I've combined quite a lot of things here, reduce on the exportation of raw materials and have these value-added products. Yeah, but the side outcome is creating jobs, or you could engage or invest in self-employment development skills for our youngsters, youth and women. Again, I summarize this by saying, let's use economic empowerment as a pathway to, let's say, representation in other spheres, such as political engagement.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that insight with us. I'd like to go to Joseph. You touched a bit on this. In the New Africa strategy, Germany wants to promote the social and climate-friendly transformation of the African economy. What do you think needs to be done?
All right, yeah, thanks so much, Sophie. I do, as I mentioned earlier on, thinking about transformation, green transformation, without having to ban extra what do you call it, carbon or greenhouse emissions. I think that if Africa's economic transformation can be driven by other sources, other ways of making sure that our economies can grow without having necessarily to burn fossil fuel, that will certainly be great. I just want to take a step back and make a note that when we talk about climate change on the continent, we have a module that we ask citizens about their experiences of climate change and the rest. And I'm saying there's a lot of support on the continent for climate mitigation action, because for those who have heard about the phenomenon and have experienced it, we have large majorities in the Afrobarometer surveys saying that they want their governments and other actors to take action now to mitigate the effects, largely because most people tell us that it's making life more and more difficult for them. And so I do think that whichever way we go, whether it is a job creation route, thinking about, gender representation and in any other sphere, just thinking of ways that we can mitigate the effects of climate change on people would be critical, because more and more people are experiencing this. They want their government to take action. The good news is that most citizens on the continent, even though debates elsewhere often make the case that the developed world has to be the one responsible for reducing or mitigating climate change, which is a good argument to make. But then on the continent, when we ask people, most people feel that they have a responsibility as individuals to contribute to climate mitigation. It's only in a few countries where there's a case of either putting the burden on government or putting the burden on the international community. But by and large, across the continent, large majorities do tell us that citizens have a role to play when it comes to climate mitigation. So in this particular case, there will be a lot of acceptance in transforming Africa's economy based on green energy. But the cost of it, as I mentioned earlier on, is who bears the cost, and how do we make sure that with this kind of transformation, even though it will be welcome, it will be accepted on the continent, given the data that we have, how do we make sure that the cost of it is actually borne by the wider network of actors who want to ensure that Africa's economies are transformed without further damaging our climate?
Yes, Elizabeth, please.
I would like to add something to what Joseph is saying. When it comes to getting the buy-in, so he's talking about, yes, the citizens wanting to see the governments engaging. There is, at least I know, the disaster risk financing strategy. I would like to see, I think, the GMZ involved more there, because I think that's a space where I'm saying the World Bank, yes, is there. The UN is also trying, but I'd like to see you there, even though you're in a partnership. Why do I say that? This creates, I would like to, for lack of a better word, pressure, but it also shows the importance of having these mitigation frameworks in place. Because for as long as the governments don't see that benefit, or they know they can run to one partner who does not emphasize that, they will probably relax, and that is not right. But if it comes from all corners, if all the partners emphasize, disaster risk, financing, including mitigation strategies, and that this should be in place, I'm sure we will create the impetus for government to find it important and subsequently listen to the cries of the population. I think I wanted to mention that because I am involved in that, but I haven't seen your institution there yet. I might be mistaken, but in the partnerships that you're creating, I'd like to see that, because it's very important, yes, what Joe is talking about in terms of climate friendly and the cries of the populations. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. I think these are very important points. Dr. Kofler, do you want to answer them directly?
Maybe a few words only.
Yeah,
I don't know if I have the exact answer on that. That might also have to do that, for example, mitigation is in Germany more or less organized through another ministry. So we have a little bit of division on that. And my ministry is very much on the issue of adaptation. And on the other hand, also on issues where we can get involved, like you might call it already a little bit loss and damage, but more in the question of having, for example, insurance systems, building up systems to support people if they have a harvest loss or whatever, to create real solutions on those issues. That doesn't mean that we are not trying to support any possible discussion or also measures with partner countries on mitigation. We have, for example, an energy partnership now just laid out with Kenya in that case, a country where a lot of investment is already took place in renewable energies. But on the other hand, still is a country where you need much more energy because not everybody has access to energy. So that's the part of growing needs, of course, has to be addressed. So we're trying also in that case, and that's then with Just Energy Transition Partnership the same, to come up with ideas on the renewable parts, on the mitigation parts, to come up with ideas on financing that and supporting that parts to renewable energies. And I think that's also, I'm the German governor for the African Development Bank, for example. We had a heavy debate on annual meeting last year on access to energy, on fulfilling the growing needs of the various countries on the African continent with energy, but doing it in a sustainable way, as much renewable as possible. So the broad range of technologies, the issue on hydrogen, the issue on power to X, the issue on renewables as a whole, how that could be used, what has to be done also off-grid if you cannot reach far remote areas, for example, to also have a kind of energy access. There are so many debates about that. And therefore, we are also trying to support the climate window of the African Development Fund, and therefore also the technical assistance there, which has to be broadened, because at the end of the day, it's also quite a technically complicated issue at the end of the day. So you have to have, especially in countries which the resources are not so high, at the end of the day, you have to have a technical assistance. And that's also an idea which was coming up at the African Development Bank from the debate there. So that's something we are supporting. But you're quite right, in a nutshell, disaster risk reduction is the key, because every disaster which is not taking place at the end of the day is good for humanity, good for the people, and at the end of the day, of course, also reducing the costs of fighting climate change. So in a nutshell, we are doing or trying to do a lot, but it's not only us.
That brings me to another point of the strategy. Critics, Dr. Kofler, missed a clearer reference to digitization and the transformation of our economic order. How do you answer them?
I'm a little bit surprised if they really read into detail the strategy, because we have so many references on especially trade, on economics in that strategy. We have, as I was pointing out before, the whole issue on African trade on the African continent, how to come really up with free trade zone, Pan-African free trade zone, what we can do in supporting that, for example, which is, I think, extremely important. And that's also part of our strategy. And the whole debate on value creation, which was pointed out before, is an important part of the strategy. And yes, starting with agricultural value chains, that's an important thing. But if we look on the continent, what could be done on digitalization and what is already going on the African continent in coming up with startups, in coming up with new ideas, in a really rapidly growing digital economic and society, we are trying to support that. I would say a little bit, we have to be a little bit modest on that, because there are other countries around the globe which are much better in digitalization than we are. Sometimes we have to maybe think about that we are not the front runners in that topic worldwide. But we had a very, very interesting event, kickoff event in December, also with Smart Africa, with the CEO, and we're subscribing a memorandum of understanding there, where we try to work together. There are initiatives like Africa Connect initiative or Make IT in Africa initiative, and so on, where we're working together closely. So I would say we see that topic is of big importance. And sometimes, as we've seen also with some software in the pandemic, we import then from various African development, for example, software, which can be used then in our health institutions. That's quite interesting. Sometimes that's for a topic for reciprocity, I would say.
Thank you. One last round. when we come to the next steps now. I think we are all curious, Dr. Kofler, what are the next steps now from with regard to the ministry? And I would also add the question for Elizabeth and for Joe. What are your expectations? What should be done next? And that would be the final round before we terminate our discussion for today. Dr. Kofler, you would like to start?
That's so difficult because there's so many steps to undertake, and a little bit I'm repeating myself because some things have to do with the alliance or with the partners we want to implement. So you have to have, of course, also a commitment with your partners, and you have to work on the topics I was discussing. Of big importance for us are the intergovernmental discussions with our African partner countries. So every year there are the ideas and the discussions coming up with the partner countries. So we are really going into a detailed discussion now with the partner countries, how to implement and what are their ideas, what should be implemented. It's a negotiation, it's a intergovernmental negotiation. Those are the next things. We have some partner countries where we came up with the just energy transition partnerships, or where that is part of it, which is quite important to come up with solutions on that. And then we have core topics. In some countries, it's health. So we talk about, it's depending also on the countries a little bit on their own priorities. So that therefore it's a little bit hard to say that's the next thing to do. We are orienting on the priorities also for our partner countries. We have partner countries where health is, for example, priority, where we already were coming up with concrete ideas to support, for example, coming up with basic security support, which is coming inside the countries. We are not financing the security system of another country, but we are coming up with working together on coming up with basic social solutions, for example, in some countries. We have, of course, acute crises which are still ongoing. The climate crisis, one thing we discussed, and the outcomes. So an investment on, for example, into resilience, where we are talking about supporting partners. We are working with the V20 on that context to come up with solutions on the loss and damage issue is of big importance. We are working, we will have a big social security summit in June in Berlin, where we discuss on that issue, how we can go further on that. We're working with World Bank and ILO to come up with concise solutions on, for example, decent work and social security, job accelerator, and topics like that. So we're working on that topic quite intense. Wow, the list is so long. I'm sure I forgot half of it. So
I think we have we got a glimpse of that the workload still is high. Maybe we should now it's Joseph and then Elizabeth at the end. What is your expectation, Joseph?
Right, maybe a couple of ideas. One being, the emphasis on youth and job creation. I think that is super critical, largely because our surveys do show that unemployment is always the top of mind of people in terms of the most important issue that they want their governments to address. And so, as BMZ and the ministry rolls into this the implementation phase, I think thinking about people's priorities is not just what the government is prioritizing, but what our citizens saying are the priorities. And I think trying to link those two up and make sure that interventions are in sync with what the population actually is looking for, as opposed to just what a government official says. Sometimes governments, of course, also look into people's priorities and they use that as a basis for what they are prioritizing. But often is a case that some of the priorities might be misaligned. So just thinking about, okay, you're prioritizing this, but your citizens say that what should be the priority. I think having those critical conversations can be healthy for partnerships. The second piece is thinking about partnerships with civil society groups. I know civil society is one of the big areas that the BMZ is prioritizing, and engagement with civil society in ways that allows them to be able to adapt quickly to situations when they arise, because often some relationships or funding support can be so restrictive that even when a civil society group wants to intervene quickly in a particular area, say to bring in evidence or to engage in some ways, sometimes some restrictions in terms of what you can use funding for can limit how much they're able to actually quickly adapt to changing situations. And given that with climate change and everything else, there's just a lot of fluidity in the system that they need to be very capable of adapting quickly to situations. And if the funding is arranged such that they can't adapt, then it actually defeats the purpose. So just thinking about that, those kinds of partnerships. And then finally, I think for me, I think about technology on the continent, and Secretary, you rightly pointed it out. I think there's a lot of innovation on the continent. There's a lot of entrepreneurial skill in the space of technology, and thinking of ways to really invest in that and supporting young people who are very innovative in this space would be very, very important. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Joseph. Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to point out a few things here as I look forward. I'll emphasize perhaps one, that is trade-offs. And in executing the strategy or implementing it, I appreciate that there's still many steps to go. I would like us to think hard on the trade-offs that have to be made. Because with all policies, you're going to have police mismatches and then policy, what is the word? It's disappeared from my head. But let me give you an example. You talked about digitization. We know that as much as we have tech-savvy youths and a lot of innovative capacity or ability from them and on the continent, we also know that there is a digital divide as well, that there are as many that don't have. So we have to be careful that as we promote the digitization, we're also not increasing the divide and leaving out many that are already excluded. Connectivity is still an issue. As we know, data is expensive in some spaces vis-a-vis others. So we don't want to expand that divide. So we have to implement in such a way that we strike a balance, that we don't leave everybody behind while we are pushing the one group forward. So that could be looked into. On the other hand, there's another one. I have noticed that, let me start with the business sector, the private sector. And you notice that in the strategy, it says that you partner with the financial institutions, raise capital, and then that capital is allocated to the companies. Yeah. And I'm getting the sense that you're talking about big companies, and these are not necessarily the type of companies that will be suffering from capital. I am wondering whether you're not leaving behind small and medium enterprises, or it wasn't explicit. If it was intended and it wasn't just explicit, I would request to propose that it is made explicit so that the private sector doesn't feel that it is left out, because I see that they already perhaps critiquing some of the issues, or they could critique it. So don't leave them behind. Let's also be transparent on who are these companies and enterprises that would be sponsored, that would be accommodated in this strategy. Transparency is important in terms of the criteria. All right. Then I also have something that's a little bit, I think you've touched on it in your last statement, in your closeout remarks. You're talking about, let's say, social safety nets. And I'll pick on the one, for instance, refugee support for host countries. There is something that might be an unintended consequence here. As you're supporting these countries, what are the conditions? Maybe that is something I have to read in depth on. We don't want to get into a scenario where there is support that is going towards these host communities or host countries, and that support goes into social safety nets for the refugees and at the expense of the indigenous citizens, especially youth. Why do I say this? As I move around or across the continent, you begin to find youths, indigenous youths, kind of seeking audience and friendship with the refugees because they see them getting funds. These are some of, I think, the safety nets or social welfare support that they get. And as those refugees are integrated within the societies, you're faced with another discrepancy, that these ones are doing better, whereas the host country citizens, especially the youth that are so unemployed, are left out. Would there be maybe some conditionalities? Maybe I'm going to step further, but it's all in the trade-offs. How do we support and implement a strategy without necessarily compromising or bringing forth an unintended consequence that in itself is going to compromise the efforts that are underway? So those are the few things that have come to my mind, and I'm looking forward to that fact sheet that will show us, what has been done, what is new in the new strategy, and happy to engage even further if I can be of more help. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing. And a big shout out to our three guests for this very informative discussion. This is the 23rd edition of Africa Talks on the topic, a new strategy for cooperation with the African continent. We hope you enjoyed your time with us.
Thank you, Secretary of State Bärbel Kofler. Thank you, Dr. Elizabeth Nanziri. And thank you, Joseph Asunka. I think that was a very good discussion. And we are looking forward to look about the next steps coming up with the new strategy. We here on Africa Talks, we have another edition in 2 weeks. Next on Africa Talks is hydrogen, the savior of the energy crisis, ? Will be again about green hydrogen, about energy, and I think this is also will be also a good talk in 2 weeks. Looking forward to discussing that with our guests in 2 weeks. So far, we are here at the end of this edition number 23. Thank you very much. Goodbye, take care, and stay healthy.
Goodbye.
Goodbye to everybody. Thank you.